Good afternoon, Ben Marcus. You've been spending the whole week in Heidelberg as you're participating in the DAI project Science as Religion, with a question mark behind it. For this, you are doing an internship in various scientific institutions in Heidelberg to find out how strongly nowadays the sciences are taking over the traditional role of religion as far as meaningfulness, norms and values, also orientation are concerned. Afterwards, you will write a literary text on your findings. We'll have a great meeting, a town hall meeting with all the participating authors in Heidelberg. And my question to you now is, what made you curious to take part in this project?
I was instantly fascinated. I think that I already, maybe more subconsciously, without really feeling aware of it, am borrowing and kind of in conversation with both sort of scientific and religious history. And both are forms of knowing. Both are a way to kind of contain curiosity, to satisfy it. I'm very attracted to how we can reconcile and sort of live with uncertainty. That in Jewish philosophy, in the Jewish faith, there's a very open embrace of uncertainty. It sort of suggests that if you feel too knowing, too clear, too understanding, then you're actually off track. And this comes from Kabbalah and sort of the more mystical side of Jewish history. And so the spirit of that, to me, seems also like a scientific value, that you proceed from a point of not knowing, of curiosity, and you try to maneuver towards some kind of understanding, towards some kind of certainty. And so, I think, when I was younger as a writer, I was very interested in the language of science, really free of the content. I don't have a deep scientific education, but what I noticed was that science had a way of making things seem true. Very good way, very serious way. And as a young writer of fiction, I thought, I want that, because I would like whatever I say to seem true. So what is authority? How do why do we believe something a scientist says? And so these were a number of things rattling around in my head when I was invited to take part in this project. And it just seemed like a perfect opportunity, well, also to learn a little bit about real specific scientific practices, because I just knew nothing. So,
we tend to believe that we only gain insight through sciences, through scientific methods. Now you talked about uncertainty. To what extent do you think can we gain insight and understand and learn things through the views or the eyes of religion?
I think it's a personal, private question, really. I don't think there's some objective container of information that's going to satisfy everybody. One of the things I ended up discussing with many scientists this week at both the EMBL and the DKFZ was what I notice a lot, at least in America, a very public, pronounced mistrust of science. In other words, if science declares it, it's almost kind of certainly untrue. And I learned that this is not such a kind of problem here, but it was an interesting thing to try to wonder about. Now, how do any of us arrive at certainty, and what is faith? These are very complicated questions, because I remember growing up, I would have friends who had what seemed like a very solid faith in their religion. And I felt envious, really, because I didn't have that, and I didn't know how to have that. But nor did I think that they were, making it up. So it seems, who knows? Is there something biological? Is there something cultural? There's something social. I think if you grow up in a context with parents who deeply believe something, these things probably all contribute to certainty. What what interests me about science is a very kind of rigorous form of skepticism that gets practiced. And how can you sustain, let's say, religious certainty while also practicing skepticism? I again sort of feel, at least in a philosophical way, that mystical Judaism is almost both things. it's about questing for knowledge and not ever thinking, aha, I know exactly what the universe is, where we came from, why we're here.
Just tracing backwards, backwards, backwards.
Yeah, so I find actually that certainty is not so interesting to me.
Okay. Other authors in this project dealt with cosmology or neurology. You decided especially for the field of autoimmunity.
Yes.
Why did attract you exactly to this field?
Well, so the immune system, the thing that keeps us healthy if we get a bacteria, the thing that supposedly will fight off cancer or any kind of problem that arises in the body is very poorly understood. I learned this week that while we can measure the heart and see how it's responding to certain conditions, we can even kind of do a historiography of the heart and see how it's behaved over time. There's actually no way to measure the immune system. In fact, it's very unclear where exactly it is. It was often thought to be in the, I mean, it is partly in the thymus. It's now spoken of as being in the intestinal tracts. So the immune system interests me precisely because the research is young. It's fledgling, I think. It's a vast and uncertain space. But autoimmunity interests me because it seems like a very physical expression of self-loathing. In that the body decides, autoimmunity is when your immune system makes a mistake and attacks your own body, your tissue, your blood, your bones.
Against yourself.
And the fact that our bodies can do this, I find metaphorically so potent, so scary, so interesting, that I kind of can't stop thinking about it. It seems like a terrible power to contain inside us, that something can happen where our bodies more or less can self-destruct, regardless of any outside force.
It could be something alluring under the surface.
And I've wanted to learn a little bit more about this. I've written I've written some fiction that in part treats autoimmunity. I once suffered from an autoimmune disorder, so I unfortunately suddenly had to learn a lot more about it, but it's often the last thing a doctor diagnoses.
That's true.
It takes a long time for doctors to diagnose it, and then the treatment is completely savage. It's simply the symptoms. Well, the primary treatment is to turn off the immune system entirely, which is not really a great solution, because then you're susceptible to all kinds of infections. And so there's something very sort of worrisome and interesting and provocative about it. The fact that the science is kind of not very evolved. All of these things are suggestive to me.
Okay. Is there a special finding or thought which has come to you as a surprise during your conversations?
Yeah, there are a lot. I'm still thinking about them. I'm sort of trying to quickly make notes. You know, I think that one thing I just mentioned, that there's really no cogent way to measure the immune system is surprising, but also, I mean, in some sense, in retrospect, not that surprising. One of the things that I discovered too is that we think of, you know, a cell has a set of instructions embedded in it, and it can be told to kind of and it has certain things called antigens that it can fight against. It can fight against, so if a tumor starts to grow, it says, oh, that's not supposed to be there. It goes out and, you know, beats up the tumor. Now, what's interesting though is these cells have, this might just get too technical and it'll also prove my own inability to fully grasp the concept, but the cells have multiple antigens, so not just for foreign bodies, like a tumor, but for things in the body. So you can't simply just find the cell that only has self-antigens, in other words, cells that attack us, and wipe that out. So cells have multiple functions, and it's not clear why. And one of the interesting theories put forward by someone I spoke with this week is that the cell has to somehow be able to respond to such a broad variety of threats that has to naturally include the body itself. That someone said, and I'm still sort of processing this, that in the end there's very little difference between what is the body and what is not the body. Which to me sounds very counterintuitive and difficult, and yet I think at the cellular level I could understand if you're not having any emotional relationship to what we are and what the world is. I can see how that might start to look like an interesting point. So that's very suggestive to me for fiction, and it's giving me a lot to think about.
It always also sounds a bit like a kind of sophisticated warfare, like what makes an enemy an enemy?
Yes, well, yeah, exactly. And so I've only just finished my interviews last night, and already I'm sort of trying to think about it in those terms, that in essence we carry a weapon inside of us, but it's a sort of a weapon against ourselves. And you know, there's so much language around how people are their own worst enemies and people get in their own way. In sort of psychological terms, the way we defeat our own progress. So it's interesting to find at the cellular level an example of this.
Very intriguing.
Yeah, it really is.
Yeah. Coming back again to the relation between science and religion, there is a famous saying by Heisenberg, which I only know in German, but I tried to translate it into English now. He said, "The first mouthful from the cup of science makes you an atheist, but at the bottom of the cup, God is waiting." What relations do you see nowadays between religion and science? Or do you see any at all?
It's a great quote, but I don't see any example of it. You know, this is the question that we worked with, you know, of these connections between science and religion. I found really very little traction in any of my conversations, in that the scientists, not a single one really had any interest in religion, and but some were completely respectful, but they felt it was just simply a completely other sphere and couldn't equate their own pursuit with a religious one.
Okay.
Others said that science had more or less toppled the problem of religion, not really recognizing that people come to their certainty in different ways. It does seem that the way science has been marketed sometimes, that in the end it will deliver us to the kind of truth we seek through religion. So there's this book, The God Particle, which is a physics book that's sort of meant to suggest that once we penetrate deeply enough beneath the cork and all of this, we will find something that is going to be so revealing that
kind of mystical,
but tangible, a kind of way to finally understand the meaning of life, the origin of life, and the purpose of life. And it turns out that The God Particle is not the real title of this book. Supposedly it was meant to be called The God Damn Particle.
Oh, really?
As in accursed. I'm reporting what somebody told me. I haven't actually followed up on any of this. But that it seems as though there's an urge when a scientific finding is published and presented to the public and sold, that there is a desire to suggest that science is going to solve our religious urgings. But you know, ironically, if science continues to succeed, it's not, if anything, religion could kind of, religious practice could increase, because it's not clear that the two are scratching the same itch, as we might say. Like the comfort one might get from religion is not exactly the same as a different kind of satisfaction you might get from science. So I mean, they seem to be so divergent. And in America, they seem almost oppositional, really. At least as you see it expressed in public. Religious practice seems to be almost a direct kind of negative response to scientific findings. You know, and findings on the climate are renounced with sort of religious certainty. So, you know, I'm not exactly sure how easy it is to talk about the similarities anymore. And I certainly didn't meet any scientists who felt that what they were doing was kind of a fundamentally religious practice. It seemed to them religion was a kind of inexact, humanistic sort of voodoo, witchcraft.
So their opponent.
Set of superstitions. But no one seemed particularly threatened by that.
Okay. Going deeper into religion, the position religion has in today's societies, if I put this very broadly, is at least an ambiguous one. You have people's desire for kind of overcoming their material lives. At the same time, you have religion connected to fundamentalism and violence nowadays. Often enough, it's also a conversation stopper. How do you think, in what way is it possible to talk about religion today? In what language?
It's a very good question, because as you say, religion is used in a lot of different ways. It's used politically, and it's used with quite a lot of aggression, and wars are fought in the name of religion, but always have been. I mean, it's hard to find a war that was not somehow fought in the name of religion. There are some. So, you know, can there be a common ground? I mean, it would seem more that what we're talking about is a broader civility and sense of decency. That's and this is really about tolerance, tolerance for difference of perspective across the disciplines, but across the cultures as well. And you know, if we see, you know, from my perspective, the attacks of ISIS really have nothing to do with the Muslim religion. But if people are afraid of what has happened and they're not particularly informed, it's also understandable that they extrapolate this fear so that it turns into a prejudice against all Muslims. And we're seeing this play out today in America. And thankfully, it seems that there are plenty of mainstream voices very concertedly pointing out that the attacks of ISIS have very little to do with real religion. That it's a tool, it's a manipulative tool, and it's not civilized to sort of generalize based on that. So I don't have a good answer to your question. I don't understand how we'll get to that point if there isn't a basic curiosity towards other people, empathy about the experiences of others, the belief perhaps that someone else might be having an experience totally different from yours, but they're still a human being. And I think as long as we remain interested in each other and civil and tolerant, then those conditions might make this possible.
Openness also.
Yeah, absolutely.
One last question. What do you think can literature do for man?
Everything. I think it does what religion does and what science does, and I think it's impossible to generalize about, because we could go to literature to escape our lives and escape the fundamental problem of being somebody who's going to die, or we could go to literature, in fact, to be in sort of immediate proximity to that problem. I mean, I read primarily to get as close as I can to those fears in a dramatic and vital and potent way, because to me that feels honest, to get as close to the things that really kind of stalk me at night and worry me the most. But we also might read to forget everything, because we need to do that as well. I don't think we can put our faces to the fire day and night. And so religion is very broad in its effects and its purposes, and people go to it for very different reasons. It's entertaining, but it's also terrifying. It's evasive and silly, or it's penetrating and truthful and uncomfortable. It's incomprehensible and obscure, or it's relevant and topical and right to the moment. So I think
the world, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah. You know, people have different ways of capturing the world, and then people say, you know, screw it. I don't want to capture the world. I want to capture what life is like in my small town. I would like people to know what it feels like to wake up in this place and live in this place. So the fact that we're all interpreting the mission of literature differently is what makes it exciting, and what it's art. It's not necessarily subservient to any kind of institutional needs. It can be, but it also won't be. So, you know, we can find commercial, kind of superficial and cliched literature, and then we can find anti-commercial, difficult avant-garde literature, and we really can go and read what we like. So I don't mean to be evasive, but it's just so broad. And I think this collision that you're setting up here at the DAI really interests me. I can't wait to read what other people do, because I think bringing literature in with a potentially oblique perspective on these two kind of monolithic enterprises seems like a really nice way to, you know, you're sort of triangulating, adding this third perspective to see what happens. I think it's really interesting to me, so I can't wait to read the results.
Fine. I'm also very much looking forward to reading your text.
Thank you. I'm looking forward to writing it. You're welcome.
Ben Marcus.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.